"You'll love it here, Mom," he said, the brochures for the luxury clinic shining under my reading lamp. The door to my life clicked shut right then, and the silence in the room was suddenly heavier than a tombstone. What I found in that pristine, quiet place wasn't peace. It was a butcher's shopping list, and my name was on it. They thought I was just a confused old woman, but they severely underestimated a librarian. What I did next exposed everything. So stay with me until the end. Subscribe, leave a like, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from, whether it's from your city, at work, or even from the comfort of your couch. My name is Helen Adler, and I am 72 years old. For most of my life, my world was measured in the quiet, dusty scent of aging paper and the satisfying click of a card catalog drawer. As a retired librarian from the main library at UNC Chapel Hill, my greatest skill was finding order in chaos, seeing the patterns others missed. My days had a rhythm as comforting as a well-loved poem. The morning began with the gurgle of the drip coffee maker, the specific weight of my favorite ceramic mug in my hands, and the challenge of the New York Times crossword puzzle, a ritual that kept my mind sharp and the world at bay. My condo, nestled on a quiet street not far from the bustle of Franklin Street, was my fortress of solitude. It wasn't grand, but it was mine. Every inch a reflection of a life carefully lived. Sunlight filtered through the leaves of the African violets I kept on the windowsill, casting dappled light on my two worn velvet armchairs. The air always smelled of old books, lemon polish, and whatever was simmering on the stove. It was a place where silence was a companion, not an enemy, a space where I felt not old, but whole, surrounded by the tangible evidence of my own history. The first crack in that foundation appeared a month ago. It was a stupid, simple thing. I tripped over the edge of the living room rug while carrying a basket of laundry. I caught myself on the armchair, ending up with nothing more than a bruised knee and a startled gasp. It was over in a second, but for my son, Richard, it was the beginning of a campaign. His weekly visits, once a source of quiet joy, became inspections. I'd see his eyes, the eyes of a successful real estate executive, scanning my home not for its warmth, but for its hazards. The rug, the single step down into the kitchen, the bath mat. Everything became evidence in a case he was building against my independence. The verdict was delivered on a Tuesday afternoon. Richard arrived not with his usual offering of fresh bread from the local bakery, but with a sleek, leather-bound folder. He sat across from me, his posture too formal for my cozy living room, and placed a glossy brochure on the coffee table between us. The title, Golden Oaks Senior Resort, gleamed under the lamplight. "Mom, we need to talk," he said, his voice laced with a practiced seriousness that made my stomach tighten. That brochure, so full of smiling, vibrant seniors, felt like the most profound insult of my life, an eviction notice disguised as a gift. I stared at my son, trying to find the boy who used to build forts with couch cushions in this very room. All I could see was a stranger in an expensive suit, a man who saw his mother as a liability, a problem to be managed and filed away. The scent of his cologne, something sharp and corporate, felt like an invasion, overpowering the familiar smell of my home. He was a salesman, and I was his most difficult client. The product he was selling was the end of my life as I knew it, and he was marketing it as a paradise. He launched into his pitch, his words smooth and rehearsed. "It's not a nursing home, Mom. It's a luxury senior community," he insisted, pointing to pictures of immaculate gardens and a sparkling swimming pool. "Think of it. No more cooking, no more cleaning. You'll have gourmet meals, activities, and 24-hour medical assistance. It's about peace of mind, for you and for me." I just nodded, my throat too tight to form a rebuttal. Every word he spoke erased a piece of me, painting my cherished routines as burdens I should be desperate to shed. A seed of doubt, cold and insidious, began to sprout within me. He spoke of my loneliness, of the long, quiet hours between his visits. Was he right? I looked around the silent room, at the empty armchair where my husband, David, used to sit. For 10 years, That silence had been filled with memories, a comforting presence. But now, through Richard's eyes, it felt like a vacuum, a dangerous void. The fear he was projecting began to feel real, the fear of another fall, of being unable to reach the phone, of being found hours or days later. He must have sensed my wavering resolve because he flipped to a specific page in the brochure and pushed it towards me. "Look, they even have a magnificent library," he said, his voice triumphant, as if this was the detail that would seal the deal. I looked at the photograph. A group of elderly residents sat in plush chairs, holding books with pristine covers. But there was something unsettling about their placid smiles and vacant eyes. They weren't reading. They were props in a perfectly staged photograph. A chill snaked its way up my spine. It was the first sign, the first note in a symphony of wrongness that I was only just beginning to hear. I tried to fight back with the only weapon I had left: practicality. "Richard, this place must cost a fortune," I said, my voice thin but steady. The glossy paper of the brochure felt slick and dishonest beneath my fingertips, like a contract with hidden clauses. I wanted to show him I was still lucid, still capable of managing my own affairs, that I understood the value of $1, even if he seemed to have forgotten the value of a home. His response was a casual wave of the hand, a gesture that dismissed my life savings and my sense of fiscal responsibility in one fell swoop. "Don't you worry about the cost, Mom. That's my concern. It's all taken care of," he said. The ease with which he said it was more belittling than any argument. It was another reminder that I was no longer in control, that my role had been reduced to that of a passive recipient of his decisions, a financial burden he was now wealthy enough to manage efficiently. My mind searched for an ally, a voice of reason, but the room was empty save for the two of us. I thought of David, my late husband. He would have seen right through this. He would have put a steadying hand on my arm and said, "Helen, your mind is a steel trap. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." But his voice was just an echo in my memory, drowned out by the confident, persuasive baritone of my son, who was systematically dismantling my world with a smile. In a desperate attempt to stall, to find a flaw in his perfect plan, I pointed to the schedule of activities printed in a cheerful, looping font. "Water aerobics at 10 a.m.? I asked, trying to inject a note of light-hearted absurdity. "Richard, you know I can't swim. I'm afraid of the water." He simply chuckled, a sound that was supposed to be reassuring but felt patronizing. "You can learn, Mom. It's never too late for a new adventure." His relentless optimism was a cage, each cheerful suggestion another bar locking me in. The pressure was becoming unbearable, a physical weight in my chest. He framed his insistence as an act of profound love. "I just want you to be safe. I lie awake at night worrying about you here all alone," he said, his eyes softening with what looked like genuine concern. And that was the cruelest part. He was using my love for him, and his supposed love for me, as the ultimate tool of coercion. To refuse his offer was to refuse his care, to be labeled as stubborn, ungrateful, and a source of his constant anxiety. The very walls of my home, once a source of comfort, now felt like they were closing in on me. The familiar scent of my violets seemed to be fading, replaced by the imaginary sterile, antiseptic smell of golden oaks. I saw my future laid out in the brochure's timeline: scheduled meals, polite nurses with empty smiles, and a slow, medicated descent into oblivion. The loss of my small, precious freedoms, the freedom to eat when I was hungry, to sleep when I was tired, to read until dawn, felt like a death sentence. A final, small flare of defiance rose in me. "I'm not going," I said. The words were quiet, but they hung in the air with the weight of a gavel. For a brief second, I saw a flicker of raw irritation in Richard's eyes before it was expertly masked by a look of patient understanding. It was the look of a man who was used to getting his way, a man who knew how to wait out any resistance. The polite facade had cracked just enough for me to see the steel beneath. He let out a long, theatrical sigh, a sound perfectly calibrated to make me feel selfish and unreasonable. "Okay, Mom, I hear you," he said. leaning forward and placing his hand over mine. His skin was smooth and cool. "How about this? Just a trial period. 1 week. Think of it as a vacation. If you hate it, I'll come pick you up myself. No questions asked." What can 1 week hurt? The question hung in the air between us, a baited hook disguised as a reasonable compromise. And I now know it was the most dangerous question anyone had ever asked me. A trial period. The phrase was a lifeline, and I clung to it. It sounded so harmless, so temporary. It offered an escape route, a way to end this exhausting confrontation without a permanent surrender. The fight had drained me, and looking at Richard's determined face, I knew he had endless reserves of energy for this battle. The grandfather clock in the hall ticked loudly in the silence, each tick a second of my independence slipping away for good. I looked at him, really looked at him, searching his face for a hint of deception. All I saw was the earnest, worried expression of a son who believed he was doing the right thing. Was I the one who was wrong? Was I being paranoid, clinging to a past that was no longer safe for me? A librarian's mind craves clear definitions and categorized facts, but this was a murky swamp of emotion, guilt, and fear. The line between care and control had become so blurred I could no longer see it. My mind raced, weighing the options. I could say no again, dig in my heels, but that would mean more arguments, more strained Sunday visits, and the constant, wearying knowledge that I was the source of his worry. I would be throwing his gift, his expensive solution, back in his face. The emotional toll of that prolonged conflict felt more daunting than the prospect of packing a small suitcase for 7 days. And so, the surrender came, not with a bang, but with a tired, defeated whisper. "All right, Richard," I said, the words feeling foreign on my tongue. 1 week. The relief that washed over his face was instantaneous and overwhelming. It was so potent, so complete, that it felt less like relief for my well-being and more like the profound satisfaction of a difficult project finally completed, a stubborn line item checked off a long to-do list. He immediately shifted into a mode of brisk efficiency, the emotional negotiation over. "Great. That's great, Mom. I'll call them right now and make the arrangements. They have a lovely room available. They can have you settled in by tomorrow afternoon." The speed of it all was dizzying, a whirlwind of logistics that left no room for second thoughts. The decision had been made, and the current was already pulling me away from the shore. That night, after he had left, my condo felt hollow, already echoing with my absence. It was no longer a sanctuary, but a museum of a life I was about to leave behind. Every object I touched, the smooth, cool spine of a first edition, the chipped rim of my favorite teacup, felt like a final goodbye. I felt like a ghost haunting my own home, my presence already fading as I prepared for my departure. I packed a small suitcase, the task feeling surreal. I chose my items carefully, like talismans to ward off the unknown. A few well-loved paperbacks, my book of New York Times crosswords, and the small, silver-framed photograph of David and me on our wedding day. They were small, tangible pieces of my identity, a desperate attempt to prove to myself that I would still be Helen Adler when I was inside the walls of Golden Oaks. The musty smell of the old suitcase filled the air, the scent of things put away for a long, long time. I spent my last hours of freedom sitting in my velvet armchair, the one that held the perfect impression of my body from thousands of hours of reading. The fear was no longer a vague sense of unease. It was a cold, hard knot deep in my stomach. I felt utterly and profoundly alone. A book being decommissioned from the library, its future uncertain, I was being sent away for my own good, a phrase that felt more threatening with each passing moment. The next morning, Richard's sleek, black sedan pulled up to the curb precisely on time. It looked unnervingly like a hearse. As he took my small bag from my hand, his smile was bright and reassuring. "You're going to love it, Mom," he said again, the phrase now sounding like a hollow, memorized line. I took one last look at my living room window, at my violets soaking up the morning sun, before getting into the car. The heavy door closed with a solid, definitive thud, and I felt the click of a lock, not on the car, but on the rest of my life. I was trapped, en route to a gilded cage, and I didn't even know the half of it. Golden Oaks received me with the sterile embrace of a hospital and the forced cheerfulness of a cruise ship. My room was immaculate, overlooking a manicured lawn that looked too green to be real. The air hummed with the quiet efficiency of the climate control system and carried a faint, cloying scent of lavender and antiseptic. A young woman named Sarah, with a smile that never quite reached her eyes, showed me the daily schedule laminated on the back of the door. It was a life broken down into manageable, soulless blocks. 8 a.m., breakfast, 10 a.m., gentle stretches, 12 p.m., lunch. It was a timetable for waiting to die, and I felt a wave of nausea. I tried to replicate my home routine, a small act of rebellion. I unpacked my crosswords and my books, arranging them on the small, particle board desk. But the environment was resistant to personalization. The silence here was different from the companionable quiet of my condo. It was a heavy, medicated silence, punctuated only by the soft-soled shoes of nurses gliding down the hallway like ghosts. The other residents I saw in the common areas moved with a slow, dreamlike quality, their gazes unfocused. They were ships in a fog, passing one another without acknowledgement. The food was as pristine and lifeless as the decor, perfectly portioned, artistically arranged, but utterly bland, as if the very concept of flavor was a dangerous variable that needed to be controlled. During my first meal in the grand dining hall, I sat at a table with 3 other women. I tried to start a conversation, asking one of them about the book she was holding. She just looked at me with cloudy, uncomprehending eyes and mumbled something about the color of the jello. The loneliness was more profound here, surrounded by people, than it ever was in my empty house. Richard called that first evening, his voice booming with manufactured enthusiasm through the phone. "So, how's the vacation, Mom? Are you loving it?" I couldn't bring myself to tell him the truth, that I felt like a specimen under a microscope. I just said, "It's very clean, Richard." He took that as a resounding endorsement, launching into a story about a big real estate deal he was closing. I was just another item on his checklist, successfully managed and filed away. I hung up feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. My nights were the worst. In my own bed, I knew every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the leaves outside my window. Here, the silence was absolute, unnatural. Sleep wouldn't come. I lay awake for hours, my mind racing, replaying my son's words, his easy dismissal of my life. I started noticing the small inconsistencies, the details a librarian is trained to see. The night staff moved with a different kind of purpose than the day staff, less about comfort, more about brisk, quiet tasks performed behind closed doors. The other residents were given a small cup of pills with dinner, which they took without question. They called them evening vitamins. When the nurse, Sarah, offered them to me, I politely declined, citing a sensitive stomach. She smiled her empty smile and said, "Dr. Miller insists. It helps everyone get a restful night's sleep." Her insistence was gentle but firm, and I had to lie, saying my personal doctor had advised against any new supplements without his review. Her smile tightened for a fraction of a second before she moved on. It was a tiny crack in the placid facade, but I saw it. My librarian's mind, starved for a puzzle to solve, began to catalog these details. The way certain residents seemed more lethargic after a visit to the wellness clinic on the West Wing. The hushed conversations between nurses that would abruptly stop whenever I approached. The high-tech medical equipment I glimpsed through briefly opened doors, far more advanced than what would be needed for routine geriatric care. I felt a growing sense of dread, a feeling that I was a character in a book who had missed the crucial foreshadowing in the first chapter. On the third night, I couldn't stand the suffocating silence of my room any longer. It was well past 2 a.m., and the hallway was lit only by dim safety lights along the floor. I slipped out of my room, my old, soft-soled slippers making no sound on the polished linoleum. I told myself I was just going to the common room library to find a book, But my feet carried me in the opposite direction, towards the west wing, towards the source of my unease. I was driven by a lifetime of instinct. When something doesn't add up, you go back to the source material. The wellness clinic was supposed to be closed, but a sliver of light escaped from under the main office door. I could hear the murmur of a single voice. My heart started to pound. A frantic, trapped bird in my chest. I flattened myself against the cool wall next to the door, straining to hear. The wood of the door was thick, but the voice inside was clear enough. A woman's voice, low and professional. It was the night shift supervisor, a stern woman I'd seen earlier. She was on the phone, her tone clinical and detached. "The cross-match is complete," she said. "Tissue compatibility is a 97% match. It's better than we hoped for." A cold sweat broke out on my forehead. These were not words one used in a senior living facility. This was the language of transplants, of operating rooms, of life and death calculations. My breath caught in my throat. A sharp, painful gasp I had to swallow back down. I pressed my ear closer to the door, my entire body trembling. "Yes, the client is very pleased," the woman continued. "The urgent overseas order will be ready for transport on schedule. Just confirm the logistics with the charter flight." Overseas order. Charter flight. My mind, trained to connect disparate pieces of information into a coherent whole, began to assemble a picture so grotesque, so monstrous that I wanted to scream. Then came the words that stopped my heart. "Don't worry about the asset. The one in room 12 is already prepped and fully sedated. She won't be any trouble." Room 12. That was Mrs. Gable, the woman with the vacant eyes who couldn't talk about anything but the Jell-O. The sweet, harmless woman who had been my dinner companion. A wave of ice-cold horror washed over me. So powerful it almost buckled my knees. She wasn't a resident. She was an asset. A collection of compatible tissues. I stumbled back from the door, my hand clamped over my mouth to stifle a cry. The pieces clicked into place with the sickening finality of a morgue drawer sliding shut, the intensive medical screenings upon admission, the evening vitamins that induced a chemical fog, the residents, vacant stairs, the state-of-the-art medical wing. This wasn't a resort. It wasn't even a nursing home. It was a farm, a human farm, where the elderly were harvested for parts, their bodies sold to the highest bidder. My first thought was of Richard, my son. Had he known? Had he brought me here, to this place, knowing what it was? The thought was a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. Was his concern for my safety just a cover story for something infinitely more sinister? Or was he just a fool? A naive son taken in by a glossy brochure and a convincing sales pitch? At that moment, I didn't know which possibility was more terrifying. I made my way back to my room in a daze, each step an monumental effort. The familiar hallway now seemed like a corridor in a slaughterhouse. Every closed door was a potential holding pen. The lavender-scented air now smelled of death and deception. I fumbled with my keycard, my hands shaking so violently it took 3 tries to get the door open. Once inside, I leaned against it, my body racked with silent, terrified sobs. My initial instinct was pure panic. I had to get out. I had to call the police. I had to scream and shout until someone listened. But then, the librarian in me took over, the part of my brain that was cold, analytical, and logical. Who would believe me? An old woman, recently placed in a senior facility by her concerned son, making wild, paranoid accusations against a respected, state-of-the-art institution. They would think I was senile. They would sedate me, just like Mrs. Gable, and I would become the next urgent overseas order. For a moment, I was paralyzed by the sheer hopelessness of it all. I was trapped, a fly in a spider's web, and the spider was wearing a nurse's uniform and a gentle smile. I looked at the picture of David on my nightstand, his kind eyes seeming to look right at me. "Think, Helen," I could almost hear him say. "Use that magnificent brain of yours. Find the pattern." He was right. Panic was a luxury I couldn't afford. It was a useless emotion. I sat down at the desk, the New York Times crossword puzzle lying in front of me, its neat grid of black and white squares, a stark contrast to the chaos in my mind. I picked up my pen, not to solve the puzzle, but just to feel its familiar weight in my hand. For 50 years, I had organized information. I had cross-referenced, indexed, and cataloged the whole of human knowledge. I found the truth hidden in stacks of dusty tomes and complicated filing systems. This place, Golden Oaks, was just another system, a dark, twisted, and evil one, but a system nonetheless. And every system has rules. It has schedules, protocols, and weaknesses. The people running this monstrous enterprise believed they were safe because their victims were old, frail, and dismissed by society. They saw us as inventory, not as individuals with minds that could still reason, observe, and deduce. They saw me as a confused old woman who needed help with her laundry and couldn't be trusted to live alone. They had severely underestimated a librarian. My fear began to recede, replaced by something else, a cold, hard resolve that settled deep in my bones. I would not be Mrs. Gable. I would not be another faceless asset prepped for a charter flight. I was Helen Adler, and I was going to dismantle this place from the inside out, piece by horrifying piece. My terror had burned away, leaving behind the pure, clean anger of a woman with nothing left to lose. I took a deep, steadying breath. My mind, which had been a whirlwind of panic, became still and focused. I now had a purpose. My trial week was no longer a prison sentence. It was an opportunity. I was a researcher on the most important project of my life. I would observe. I would document. I would find the proof that could not be dismissed as the ramblings of a senile old woman. I turned over the crossword puzzle, and on the blank back, I made my first entry. 2:15 a.m. Night supervisor, phone call, keywords, tissue compatibility, urgent overseas order, asset, room 12. My handwriting was shaky, but the words were clear. It was the beginning of my catalog, my secret dossier on the horrors of Golden Oaks. I was no longer a victim waiting for the slaughter. I would play their game. I would be the model resident, placid, cooperative, slightly confused. I would smile my vacant smile, take part in the gentle stretches, and compliment the flavorless Jell-O. I would let them think their chemical fog was working, that I was settling in nicely. But behind my aging eyes, the gears of my mind would be turning, cataloging every detail, every schedule, every name, every inconsistency. I looked around the sterile room, which no longer felt like a prison, but like a library of evil, and I was the only one who knew how to read the books. They had brought me here to die, to be erased and parted out like a stolen car, but they had made one critical error. They had locked me in a building full of secrets, and my entire life had been a training exercise in how to find them. The sun began to rise, casting a pale, gray light into the room. It was the dawn of my 4th day at Golden Oaks. For the first time since I'd arrived, I did not feel dread. I felt a strange, chilling sense of purpose. My son thought he was putting me in a safe place, a place where I would be cared for. He had no idea he had just placed his mother, the librarian, directly in the center of the archives, and I was about to start checking things out. My first day as a spy began with a conscious act of submission. At breakfast, I smiled vacantly at Sarah, the nurse, and complimented the oatmeal, which tasted like wet cardboard. I allowed her to help me to my seat, feigning a slight tremor in my hands. To survive in this place, I had to become what they already believed me to be, a frail, slightly confused old woman. The performance was exhausting, a constant battle between the rage simmering in my soul and the placid, harmless mask I wore. My first lesson was that my mind was my only true sanctuary, and I had to protect it by making my body a convincing decoy. My initial attempts at gathering information were clumsy, born of a desperate urgency. I tried engaging another resident, a quiet man named Arthur who always sat by the window. I asked him about his family, hoping to find a crack in his sedated shell. He just stared at the manicured lawn, murmuring about the birds. My gentle probing immediately drew the attention of an orderly, who approached with a saccharine smile and suggested I not tire Mr. Henderson out. It was a polite warning. I learned my second lesson. The other residents were not allies. They were victims, too far gone to help, and any attempt to connect with them was a red flag to our keepers. Discipline became my shield. I started using the laminated schedule on my door not as a set of instructions, but as a blueprint of my enemy's movements. I memorized the shift changes, noting which nurses were more observant and which were more complacent. On the back of a page in my crossword puzzle book, I began a crude map of the first floor, marking the locations of the security cameras I could spot, the small, black domes that watched us from the corners of the ceilings. I was cataloging the system, just as I had once cataloged books, finding its structure, its rules, and praying I could find its weaknesses. My fear was a constant, physical presence, a cold knot that lived in my stomach. One night, a wave of pure, paralyzing terror washed over me. The sheer audacity of their operation, the cold, corporate evil of it all, felt insurmountable. What was I? One 72-year-old woman with a pen and a few scraps of paper, against a multi-million-dollar machine that harvested human beings? I clutched the photograph of David, my fingers tracing his familiar smile. I could almost hear his calm, steady voice. One book at a time, Helen. That's how you build a library. He was right. I had to focus on the next step, the next piece of data, and not the terrifying whole. I began weaponizing the very stereotypes they used against me. I would pretend to be slightly deaf, forcing nurses to speak louder and more clearly to each other when they were near me. I would feign confusion about the time, which allowed me to linger in hallways and common areas, observing the flow of traffic without raising suspicion. My perceived frailty became my greatest camouflage. They saw a woman losing her grip on reality, never suspecting that I was, in fact, gripping it tighter than ever before, documenting their every move from behind a carefully constructed facade of senility. The facility's library became my new headquarters. It was a sad, neglected room, filled with unread bestsellers and large print magazines, but it had a single, outdated desktop computer for residents to email their families. For the first 2 days, I only used it to look up recipes for lemon meringue pie and to read articles about gardening. I had to build a history of benign activity. On the third day, my hands trembling slightly, I opened a new browser tab and typed in the name of the company that owned Golden Oaks, a name I'd seen on the fine print of my admission papers, Ethelred Global Health. The search results were sparse and sterile. Ethelred was a subsidiary of a larger, international conglomerate with dozens of shell corporations. Their website was a masterpiece of corporate jargon, full of meaningless phrases like holistic wellness solutions and pioneering patient-centric paradigms. There were no names, no faces, just stock photos of smiling doctors and pristine laboratories. It was a digital ghost, designed to be impenetrable. But a librarian knows that even ghosts leave traces. I found a single press release from 3 years prior, announcing their acquisition of a small, private logistics company that specialized in time-sensitive, temperature-controlled international shipping. A chill ran down my spine. My son Richard called every other evening, his voice a chipper, unbearable intrusion into my grim reality. "Having fun, Mom? Making new friends?" he'd ask. The effort it took to lie to him was a physical strain. I would tell him the food was lovely and the staff was so attentive, my voice a hollow echo of the truth. Each conversation was a fresh stab of betrayal. Did he know? The question haunted my waking hours and my fitful, dream-filled sleep. Was he a monster? Or was he just a fool? Either way, he had delivered me to this place. He had locked the door behind me. My focus shifted from data collection to escape. Proving what was happening here was useless if I couldn't get the information to the outside world. The facility was a fortress. The windows didn't open more than a few inches, and every exit was monitored by keycard scanners and cameras. I was a prisoner. My only hope was to find a flaw in their security, a human error in their perfect, monstrous machine. I started observing the support staff more closely. The cleaners, the kitchen workers, the groundskeepers. They were the cogs in the machine, the ones most likely to be careless. And then I found it. A small, beautiful moment of human fallibility. Every morning at precisely 6:15, a cleaner named Maria would start her rounds on my floor. When she reached the linen closet at the end of the hall, she would prop the door open with her cart and go inside for 2 or 3 minutes to restock. For those few minutes, her master keycard, attached to a retractable lanyard on her belt, hung tantalizingly from the side of the cart, just out of her line of sight. It was a tiny window of opportunity, a sliver of a chance, and it was everything. For a week, I rehearsed the moment in my mind. I timed her routine down to the second. I practiced my movements, a slow, shuffling walk that wouldn't draw attention. The internal conflict was a raging storm. My cautious, rule-abiding nature screamed at me to stop, that the risk was too great. But the image of Mrs. Gable's vacant eyes, of the word fulfilled, next to her name in some unseen ledger, pushed me forward. This was no longer about saving myself. It was about honoring the memory of those who had already been erased. The morning I decided to act, my heart felt like it was trying to beat its way out of my chest. My hands were slick with a cold sweat. I left my room at 6:14 a.m., shuffling down the hall just as Maria's cart appeared. As she entered the linen closet, I accidentally dropped my book. The sound of it hitting the linoleum floor was like a gunshot in the quiet hall. I bent down slowly, my joints groaning in protest, a performance of age and infirmity. My shaking hand closed around the cool plastic of the keycard. I unclipped it from the lanyard with a dexterity that surprised me. The click was almost imperceptible. I slipped the card into the pocket of my housecoat and pushed myself back up, grabbing my book. I was halfway back to my room when Maria emerged from the closet. She didn't even glance at me. My breath came in ragged, silent gasps. Back in my room, I leaned against the door, the stolen keycard feeling as heavy and as powerful as a loaded gun in my pocket. I had crossed a threshold. I was no longer a passive observer. I was an active threat. That night, sleep was impossible. The keycard was a burning coal in my pocket. I waited until 3 a.m., when the hallways were at their quietest and the night staff was at its most complacent. Slipping out of my room, I felt a terrifying surge of adrenaline. Every creak of the building, every distant hum of machinery, sounded like an approaching footstep. My target was the West Wing, the administrative offices, the heart of the beast. My slow, shuffling walk felt agonizingly conspicuous, but I forced myself to maintain the pace of a wandering, confused resident. The keycard worked. The soft green light of the scanner on the office door was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I slipped inside, closing the door gently behind me. The office was dark, lit only by the glow of a computer monitor in sleep mode. It smelled of stale coffee and industrial-grade air freshener. My goal was simple: find a piece of physical evidence, something I could smuggle out, something that couldn't be dismissed as the delusion of an old woman. My eyes fell on a metal filing cabinet against the far wall. It was locked, but the key was in the top drawer of the desk, a small act of carelessness that made my heart leap. Inside the cabinet, I found them. Files labeled Departed Residents. My hands shook as I pulled out the folder from my floor. There was Mrs. Gable, and Mr. Henderson, the man who loved to watch the birds. His file was on top. Stapled to his medical summary was a different kind of document. It wasn't a death certificate. It was a transfer manifest, an invoice addressed to Ethelred Global Health for biological materials. The price listed next to his name made me feel sick. $900,000. I fumbled in my pocket for my pen, intending to copy the information, but my hands were shaking too badly. I heard a noise in the hallway, the faint squeak of rubber-soled shoes. Panic, cold and absolute, seized me. There was no time. I ripped the top corner off the invoice, a small triangle of paper containing Ethelred's logo, a case number, and a partial account number for a bank in the Cayman Islands. I shoved the file back into the cabinet, locked it, and put the key back in the desk drawer. I slipped out of the office and made it back to my room just as a night orderly turned the corner at the far end of the hall. My heart was a wild drum against my ribs. I stood in the darkness of my room, the small, torn piece of paper clutched in my hand. It was proof. It was real. It was flimsy and small, but it was a weapon. I carefully hid it inside the spine of my hardcover copy of Leaves of Grass, a place I knew they would never look. The next morning, Richard called. "Just checking in, Mom," he said, his voice full of the same casual cheer. "Hope you're having a relaxing week." I looked at my own reflection in the dark screen of the television. The woman looking back at me was not the same one who had arrived here 10 days ago. The fear was still etched around my eyes, but it was now overlaid with something else. A hard, unyielding resolve. The soft, pliable retiree was gone, burned away by terror and fury. "Everything is fine, Richard," I said, and for the first time, my voice was perfectly steady, without a hint of the tremor I had been feigning for days. In fact, things are becoming very clear. The silence on his end of the line was brief, but I heard it. A flicker of uncertainty. He didn't know it yet, but the game had changed. His problem to be managed was about to become his worst nightmare. I spent the rest of the day in a state of heightened clarity. The other residents were still ghosts. The staff still wore their masks of false kindness. But I saw it all differently now. I was no longer just trying to survive. I was planning a war. The small piece of paper hidden in my book was the first shot fired. I didn't know what my next move would be, how I would get that proof to the outside world. But I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I would find a way. That evening, as I sat in the dining hall, I caught Sarah, the nurse, watching me from across the room. Her smile was gone. In its place was a look of cold, calculating assessment. She knew something was different. Perhaps it was the way I sat, my back a little straighter. Perhaps it was the look in my eyes. They had underestimated me. They had assumed my mind was as frail as my body. They had made a fatal error. I met her gaze and held it, my expression as placid and empty as I could make it. But inside, I felt a surge of cold triumph. Let her watch. Let them all watch. They thought they had catalogued me, filed me away in a box marked elderly and harmless. They had no idea that the librarian was now in charge of the library, and I was preparing to burn it to the ground. My transformation was complete. It hadn't happened in a gym or on a battlefield, but in the silent, terrifying corridors of Golden Oaks. I had walked in as Helen Adler, a retired widow. I would walk out as something else entirely. I was the keeper of their secrets, the witness to their crimes. I was their judge, their jury, and I was just beginning to write my verdict. The fear hadn't vanished. It had simply changed shape. It was no longer a cage. It was fuel. It powered the cold, precise engine of my mind. I looked down at my hands, the skin thin and spotted with age. They didn't look like the hands of a warrior, but they had stolen a key, opened a lock, and taken the first piece of evidence that could bring down an empire. They were stronger than I had ever known. My confrontation with Sarah's cold gaze was a declaration of war. That night, I knew my time for passive observation was over. I had to move from defense to offense. The keycard was useless now, a liability. The piece of the invoice hidden in my book was my only weapon, and it was worthless if it stayed within these walls. My mind, a librarian's mind, began to construct a plan, not of escape, but of delivery. I couldn't outrun them, but I could outthink them. The plan was terrifyingly simple and relied on the one person who had put me here, my son, Richard. He would be my unwitting courier. The next morning, I was a different kind of actress. I amplified my performance of gentle confusion, asking the same question twice in the dining hall, fumbling with my fork. I needed to lower their guard, to make them believe their suspicions were unfounded, that I was just a fading old woman having a brief moment of clarity that had now passed. I let Sarah guide me back to my room, my steps intentionally shuffling, my gaze distant. I could feel her watching me, trying to decide if I was a threat or just a sad-eyed deteriorating case. I let her see what she wanted to see. a problem that was managing itself. My last 2 days were a masterclass in feigned helplessness. I spent hours in the library, not on the computer, but simply holding a book, my eyes unfocused. I was building a narrative for them, the narrative of a woman retreating into the fog. Inside, my mind was a whirlwind of calculation and rehearsal. I took Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass from my nightstand, the book containing my precious evidence. I carefully wrote an inscription on the inside cover, "To Richard, who always finds a way to keep me safe. With all my love, Mom." It was a message of pure, sickening irony, a final twist of the knife. Richard was scheduled to visit on Sunday, the end of my trial week. I knew he would come armed with more arguments, more reasons for me to stay. He would expect a fight or a tearful surrender. He would not be expecting a gift. When he walked into my room, his smile was practiced and a little weary, ready for another round of emotional negotiation. I didn't give him the chance. I sat in my armchair, the book in my lap, and I looked at him with what I hoped was a look of resigned affection. The fight finally gone out of me. "Richard, you were right," I said, my voice soft and slightly tremulous. "This is a good place. It's for the best." I saw the wave of relief wash over him, so profound it was almost comical. He had won. He started to launch into his spiel about how I would grow to love it, but I held up a hand to stop him. "I want you to have this," I said, holding out the book. "I know you were never much of a reader, but this was your father's favorite. I want you to keep it safe for me." It was the perfect lie, wrapped in a layer of genuine sentiment. He took the book, his fingers brushing against mine. The transaction was complete. The evidence had left the building. He held it awkwardly, a man unaccustomed to such gestures. "Thanks, Mom. I'll put it on the shelf in my study," he said, his mind already moving on to the next item on his agenda. He promised to call, to visit, to handle all my affairs. I just nodded, a serene smile on my face. As he walked out of my room, out of the facility, and out of my life as I had known it, I felt a terrifying, exhilarating sense of victory. I had mailed the bomb. Now I just had to wait for it to explode. My final act was a phone call, not to the police, but to a number I had memorized from my research, the public tip line for the FBI's Raleigh field office. I went to the common room, sat at the monitored computer, and used the payphone in the lobby, a relic no one ever paid attention to. My voice was calm and clear. I identified myself, my location, and I told them to find my son, Richard Adler. I told them to look inside the copy of Leaves of Grass he was carrying. Look for a torn piece of an invoice from a company called Ethelred Global Health, I said. And then, for God's sake, get us out of here. The silence after I hung up was the most profound I had ever experienced. I had done it. There was no going back. I walked back to my room, my legs steady, and I sat in the armchair to wait. I was no longer afraid. I had set the great, complex gears of justice into motion, and all I had to do was let them turn. I thought of Mrs. Gable, of Mr. Henderson, of all the others whose names I didn't know. My victory was for them. It was a quiet, lonely tribute in a lavender-scented room, a final catalog entry for the lost. Less than 3 hours later, the quiet efficiency of Golden Oaks was shattered. It began not with a siren, but with the sudden, sharp commands of men in dark blue jackets flooding the hallways. There was no panic, just a cold, swift, and overwhelming force. Doors were opened, staff were separated from residents, and the masks of kindness on the nurses' faces dissolved into raw, ugly fear. I watched from my doorway as they led Sarah away in handcuffs, her empty smile finally gone, replaced by a look of pure, venomous hatred directed right at me. An FBI agent, a young woman with kind, intelligent eyes, came to my room. She introduced herself as Agent Miller and asked if I was Helen Adler. I simply nodded. "We found what you said we'd find, Mrs. Adler," she said, her voice a mixture of awe and disbelief. "You have no idea what you've done." But I did. I knew exactly what I had done. I had read the fine print. I had connected the dots. I had used the quiet, methodical skills of a lifetime to unravel an empire of evil. The contrast between the woman who had entered Golden Oaks and the woman who left was stark. I had arrived feeling like a burden, a relic being put into storage. I left as the key witness in a federal investigation that would span 3 continents. I walked out of that building on my own 2 feet, not as a frail old woman being rescued, but as a soldier walking away from a battlefield where she had just won an impossible war. The afternoon sun felt warm on my face, a feeling I thought I might never experience again. My condo welcomed me back not with silence, but with the scent of home, old paper, lemon polish, and my own history. It was no longer a place of solitude, but a place of strength, a sanctuary I had fought for and won back. The African violets on the windowsill seemed to stand a little taller, their leaves greener. Every familiar object was a testament to the life they had tried to steal from me, a life I had reclaimed with nothing but my wits and a will to survive. The external reactions were a whirlwind. The story was a media sensation. The librarian who uncovered a house of horrors. Reporters camped outside my building. I was hailed as a hero, a symbol of the underestimated elderly. But I ignored the noise. The only reaction that mattered was Richard's. I saw him at the FBI field office, his face pale and drawn, his expensive suit looking cheap and ill-fitting under the harsh fluorescent lights. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a dawning, sickening horror. He wasn't a monster. He was worse. He was a fool. A man so blinded by his own ambition and the inconvenience of an aging parent that he had outsourced her care to the lowest bidder with the glossiest brochure. He hadn't seen a person who needed love and respect. He had seen a line item on his life's balance sheet, a problem to be solved with money. "How could you have known, Mom?" he whispered, a desperate plea for an absolution I could not give him. "You didn't look." "Richard," I told him, my voice not angry, but heavy with a truth that was as cold and hard as a tombstone. "You didn't look because it was easier not to. It was more convenient to sign the check and believe the lie." That was his crime. Not malice, but a profound and devastating negligence born of selfishness. The legal system would deal with his complicity, but his own conscience would be his lifelong prison. Our relationship was a casualty of the war, another name in the ledger of losses. My personal reflection on this journey is not one of triumph, but of a quiet, grim satisfaction. I learned that the mind is a muscle, and the world had forgotten I had been exercising mine for 72 years. My skills as a librarian, patience, observation, the ability to find a single, crucial fact in a mountain of irrelevant data, were not obsolete. In the end, they were the most powerful weapons I had ever possessed. They were the skills that saved my life and the lives of others. Before this, I was defined by my past. David's widow, Richard's mother, a retired librarian. I was a collection of memories. But in that pristine, sterile hell, I was forced to become something new. I became a strategist, a spy, a survivor. I learned that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the methodical cataloging of it, filing it away on a shelf and choosing to act in spite of it. It's a quiet, internal process, not a loud declaration. The woman I am now understands the value of her own voice, even if it's a quiet one. I speak to advocacy groups now, telling my story not for the fame, but as a warning. I see the surprise in their eyes. They expect a frail victim, and they find a woman made of steel and footnotes. They see the proof that a sharp mind is not bound by a frail body. A truth our society is desperate to forget, because it makes caring for the elderly a much more complicated human task. This experience taught me that the greatest prisons are not made of concrete and steel, but of assumptions. The assumption that the old are weak, the assumption that the quiet are deaf, the assumption that the frail are foolish. My captors built their entire monstrous enterprise on these assumptions, and it was their undoing. They never thought to look past the gray hair and the wrinkled hands to see the mind that was watching, recording, and indexing their every crime. My life is quiet again, but it's a different kind of quiet. It is not the quiet of loneliness. but the quiet of purpose. The crossword puzzles are still a daily ritual, but now they feel less like a mental exercise and more like a sharpening of the tools that saved me. My condo is still my fortress, but its doors are now open to those who need to hear my story, to those who need to be reminded that they are not invisible. The most tangible conquest was not seeing Ethelred's executives in handcuffs or watching Golden Oaks become a crime scene. It was the moment I sat back in my own velvet armchair, picked up a book, and felt the simple, profound peace of being the sole author of my own life once again. It was the reclaiming of my own narrative, a story they had tried to end prematurely, with a monstrous, unspoken final chapter. The intangible conquest is a newfound sense of self. I am no longer just a collection of past roles. I am Helen Adler, the woman who survived. It's a title I never wanted, but one I wear with a quiet, unshakable pride. It is a reminder that my worth was never tied to my youth, my utility to others, or my physical strength. It was always there, in the quiet, methodical workings of my own mind. My message to the world, to anyone who will listen, is this: do not turn away from the elderly. Do not mistake silence for absence. Look closer. The hands that tremble may have built the world you live in. The eyes that seem distant may be seeing truths you have overlooked. The minds you believe are fading may simply be operating on a different, more patient frequency, cataloging the world in ways you can no longer comprehend. We are not problems to be managed. We are not relics to be stored. We are libraries. Each one of us is a vast, complex collection of stories, knowledge, and wisdom. And sometimes, if you are careless, if you are cruel, if you underestimate what is stored on those dusty shelves, you will find that the librarian is still there, and she knows exactly where all the secrets are buried. So, listen. Pay attention. The quietest person in the room might just be the one who understands the story better than anyone else. They might be the one who sees the pattern in the chaos, the lie in the glossy brochure. They might be the one who, when the world has written them off, is quietly gathering the evidence that will burn an evil empire to the ground. Never, ever, underestimate a librarian. This story, it's a heavy one to carry, and an even heavier one to have lived. It's strange, but sometimes I still catch the faint scent of lavender and antiseptic in the air, a ghost that reminds me how quickly a life can be devalued when no one is paying attention. It's a reminder that dignity isn't something that's given to us. It's something we must demand, sometimes in a quiet voice, and sometimes by taking a stand that terrifies us to our very bones. I often wonder how many other Golden Oaks exist, hidden behind perfect lawns and smiling faces. How many other stories like mine are waiting to be told, whispered in corridors where no one thinks to listen? If you've ever felt invisible, or watched someone you love be overlooked simply because of their age, tell me about it in the comments. Your story matters. Your voice is a light, and we need more light in the quiet, forgotten corners of the world. Sharing this isn't easy for me, but I do it because silence is what allows monsters to thrive. If this story touched you, or made you think of someone, a parent, a grandparent, a neighbor, share it with them, if you can. Let it be a conversation starter, a reminder to listen a little closer, to ask one more question, to never take a person's mind for granted. And if you want to accompany me and hear more stories like this, stories of quiet strength and unexpected courage, I hope you'll consider subscribing. It's good to know I'm not just speaking into the void, but that there are people out there who are still willing to sit and read the books that others have put back on the shelf. Thank you for staying with me until the end. It means more than you know.